Well, welcome everybody. Our Friday night Bible study. Our guest speaker tonight is Chris DeWeese from the Kansas City area. He is what would you consider yourself, an elder in your church, or the
Oh,
leader, the big
I
kid?
am actually called the pastor. Yes,
Okay, you are
that's
you
what
are
I
the
am.
pastor of the
Yeah.
Word and the Way,
Yes.
and we'll swing over to their website here. So here's the wordintheway.net, their website. You have, as you can see, they have the various different, you got all the archive messages, and um, they do videos, so you can watch their video. In fact, there's tonight's presentation. I'm sure they'll
Yeah.
add a little bit to it.
I was dressed a little nicer then.
A little bit nicer, okay. So you're also on Facebook, which I don't have that up right here, but that's thewordintheway.net if you want to. And there's a contact us if you want to get a hold of Chris and tell him that I really loved your presentation and I want to add to
Right.
it.
Right.
So
That's how that works.
Stop the share. All right. With that, I'll let Chris present and his topic and announce it and go for it.
Okay, you got it. Obviously, a real Messianic apologetic. So the nexus of this, the reason that this came about is that there has been a spat of people who study and study and study and get so far into the scriptures that they decide that Paul's not an apostle and then Yeshua is not the Messiah, and then they go down this rabbit trail. So I wanted to put something together that a very a different type of apologetic. Usually we try to do an apologetic with this verse matches that verse, and this has to be that, and this has to be that. But there is a huge pile of evidence as to why Yeshua is the Messiah sitting in Jerusalem right now, and we're going to explore that today. So today I'm going to talk a lot about history. Now, history is something that's recorded by two general people, the victors and the survivors. So history is not exactly a good place to look to know to learn doctrines or to learn anything concrete, but you just have to read it and understand that there are biases and perspectives inside of history. Now, when we talk about ancient history, it's impossible to know details. That's why today in Jerusalem, when they're on a dig and they find a coin that's got Solomon's inscription on it or David's inscription on it or something, that just gets so excited to find an actual detail that proves something, because details are difficult to prove when you get outside of scripture, when you get outside the word of God. So just for example, today's modern history books don't even come close to explaining to us the role of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in bringing down the Soviet Union. They deserve an enormous amount of credit for coming up with a plan and executing it that brought the Soviet Union down without any type of a war or any type of bloodshed. And if you read the textbooks today, they just say the wall came down, and you don't know the details of history, that there were lots of people who didn't want us to confront the Soviet Union. We just know that there was this country and it was bad, and now it's not there anymore. Isn't that wonderful? But for those of us who were alive during this time frame and remember the mutually assured destruction and the nuclear proliferation and all these treaties and all these meetings between Reagan and Gorbachev and Khrushchev and all of these sinister type people, we understand that history is rich with details. But even just 30, 40 years down the road, our kids, some don't even know that there was such a thing as a USSR. So we need to make sure when we look at history that it's written from perspectives, and very, very seldom is it purely objective. But it is what we have, and we have to use it to formulate our opinions and our doctrine sometimes. So the general blame for the fall of the Second Temple in 70 AD, as recorded inside of Judaism, is disunity among the Jewish people. That's their general rationale for as to why the temple came down. And the picture that we paint of first century Judea when we talk about this, and we just casually say, oh yeah, the temple came down in AD 70. We just casually throw that around. Even those of us who study scripture, pretty often, we don't really put that into details. So let's start and get a little bit of details as recorded by the historians. So the first century Jerusalem had roughly 4 factions. They had the Pharisees, which are legalistic, they liked tradition, they liked purity, and they held the Sanhedrin. Then there were the Sadducees. They rejected the oral law and wanted to compromise, which does not make sense to me. But that is, if you look this up anywhere, it says the Sadducees were the compromisers. And we'll get into why it doesn't make sense to me here in a minute. And we know these two parties because they communicate to Yeshua a lot in the New Testament. And then we have the Zealots. Now, Zealots are passionate nationalists. They're very similar to the Maccabees, and they're violent against Romans. And this, of course, makes the Romans have to retaliate. But these guys are thinking that if they instigate a big enough uprising, that the Pharisees and the Sadducees will have to fall in line, and they could make a unified front and confront the Romans and push them out. And then you have this group called the Sicarii, who are basically Jewish terrorists and assassins who would kill their own countrymen if they compromised. And these guys were the purest of the pure. They were, and they didn't mind if a Jewish person of high status was known to have compromised with the Romans. They had no problem whatsoever just walking up into a crowd and stabbing them and walking away and letting them die. So these are some pretty bad dudes. So the problem I have with saying the Sadducees were the ones who compromised is it's twofold. First, we don't have those anymore. Where are they? If they are the compromisers, why didn't they survive? Because they did not survive. They went down with the ship. That doesn't. That's not generally how compromisers or people who have the capability of selling out their countrymen die. Usually they die alone and miserable. But the Sadducees actually went down with the temple. So that alone makes it very difficult to understand why they're called the compromisers. But the other fact is that these two details we have about the timeline of the fall of the Second Temple is that there are two leaders who were big time compromisers. One's called Flavius Josephus, who was a Levite. He was in charge of cities in Judea, as you know how they had Levites in the cities, and he was a Pharisee. And his job before things got bad was to go around and make the cities he was in charge of actually compromise and accept Roman rule, because he knew that if the Romans decided to, that they could kill them all. The other is a guy that we don't know that much, but his name is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, Yochanan ben Zakkai had to be smuggled out of Jerusalem to meet with Titus and made the compromise that allowed the Pharisaical Jewish people continue to exist. He made a compromise saying, we know you're going to take the temple. We know you're going to take Jerusalem. Let us keep the Sanhedrin and relocate it outside of Jerusalem so that way our faith can continue to exist. And he got it. He got it because of some miracles. And so the two people that we have who are, the people who with Josephus is the one who has this book. I forget where it is. But the book of Flavius Josephus, The Antiquities of the Jews, and that history, which used to just be sitting right next to me, is actually the history we have about the temple, what it looked like, the signs and everything, come from a Pharisee who compromised. He actually became the ambassador to the Jews from the Romans. And Jews today would call him a traitor because he was literally a traitor. And the other guy named Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was also a traitor because everybody was getting killed, and he got smuggled out of Jerusalem to go meet with Titus and make the grand compromise. So what the picture that you have of first century Judea, as we run up to the last bastion, the last few years there, is different factions, a lack of respect for leadership, a lack of respect for any leadership that is principled enough. Everybody wants purity, and there's anarchy, and there's a lot of a lack of standards. They were in a complete state of confusion. The Pharisees didn't respect the Sadducees didn't respect the Pharisees, the Zealots didn't respect either one of them, and the Sicarii were so purist that they were like, some of our friends on Facebook today, so to speak, but they were not, because the people, not saying anybody we know on Facebook is actually an assassin. That would be awful. So when the Jews were actually in this state of confusion, while the Romans were marching in to take them out, the Jews were literally killing each other within Judea. They were within Jerusalem even. They were really literally fighting amongst each other, not like we see in our political arenas today, where everybody's just saying mean things about each other and saying lies. These guys were literally fighting with each other while Rome was coming. It's very, very bad. And with all of this knowledge, it makes it even make less sense when John uses the phrase "the Jews" in the Gospel according to John, because as the more you learn about the disunity, there's really not a way to actually use the phrase "the Jews" and have it actually apply to all the nation at that time. It had to apply to just a smaller faction. So the events that caused the destruction of the temple and the second and present exile took about 120 years to play out. In 63 BC, Pompey's troops entered Jerusalem to put down fighting at the invite of Hebrew leadership. I've actually learned that there was a queen of the Jews. There was a queen in charge, and she had two sons. And when she passed, the two sons were fighting, or before she passed, they were fighting. And they invited Rome in to put down the infighting. And so they invited in Rome, which is kind of like asking the United States to come and liberate your country. We never leave. They invited Rome into their country, and Rome never left. And so we could even argue that it became longer when the Maccabees made the treaty with the Romans before they were a big nation. But in general, it's 63 BC is when the Roman soldiers entered Judea, Jerusalem, and they never left until they burnt the place to the ground. And so the point is that we can't measure prophecy in these short time frames. In the past 150 years, we've had a bunch of prophecy systems that come up and say, okay, we're at the time of the end. We saw this just the other week when we had the altercations with Iran. How many people on Facebook immediately said, okay, this is it. The army's coming from the north and this and that. They just immediately turn into these Hal Lindsey, Turner Broadcast, or Trinity Broadcast Network, prophecy experts, just at any small thing like that. But we have to understand that it took 120 years for the plan of the temple to come down. It took how many hundreds of years were the Hebrews in Egypt? 70 people went in, 2 million came out. 1 million Jews, 1 million of the mixed multitude. And so the plan of salvation is also a 6,000-year plan of salvation. It's not a 6-year campaign. So the point of this part is to show that when we talk about prophecy, we talk about rising nations and nations falling and these large events. The event to actually, have the temple come down was put in play a long time before that, and it took a very, very long time for it to pan out. So here, on slide 4 is Daniel 9:25-26. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. Now, I'm not smart enough to actually know how to count this off, but everybody who has counted it off has said that from the decree to rebuild the temple came from Cyrus of Babylon in about 536 BC, and that prophecy culmination lands squarely during Yeshua's ministry. This is why Herod knew to kill all those kids. This is what everybody knew. Are you the Messiah? Are you the Messiah? They all knew it was time. And that, again, took 500 years. 500 years for this prophecy to play out. We're upset today if Popeyes runs out of chicken. I don't know if you guys eat at Popeyes. That was just the joke that came to mind. So, we don't have 5 minutes to spare. And here is Yahweh using a 500-year period of time to show the timing of the Messiah. So back in the first century Judaism, though, or Jerusalem, Herod had built a fortress to guard the temple. And it took a very long while for the Romans to get that far into the city to where they could actually attack the temple. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were battling tens of thousands of Jews. And the carnage was immense. So just think, when Yeshua was talking about brother betraying brother to death, and you start thinking about the violence that he talks about in Matthew 24 and the other prophecies of the end days, start thinking about that right now, because the suffering was actually hell. When the Jews tried to escape, they were crucified. Titus encircled Jerusalem with his soldiers, trapping everybody inside. And when he did that encircling, it was during one of the festivals, so that way there were people trapped who didn't even live there. They had made the pilgrimage. And he starved them. He wouldn't let them eat. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people trapped inside of this city. And when they did manage to escape in the middle of the night or whatever, he would take the escaping, starving Jews and nail them up on crucifixes, facing the people they were trying to escape from, facing their countrymen. So now they're starving and they're dying on crosses. There was literally no food. That's why it was prophesied for women to eat their children. So when the Jews were famished by starvation, they managed to escape. They were crucified while starving. The people who didn't escape had to starve and look at their crucified people who managed to get out. And they're in the most helpless, hopeless situation there could possibly be. The only two choices they had were which way they were going to die: starving at the tip of the sword or starving while hanging at a cross. I'm bringing this up because there's a reason why. It's horrible. It's just horrible. The Romans laid siege works against Herod's fortress, but the Jews had craftily set up a trap that burnt the contraption, the siege works, to the ground. So that made Titus even madder. So while he was starving them, he took the people that were escaping and the slaves and made them cut down all the trees within a 13-mile circle of Jerusalem. And they didn't have power saws. They didn't have semi-trucks. They used people to do this by hand. So we're talking about this happening over a long period of time. And so the people who are in the temple are looking out at their country being cut to pieces by their own people who were being slaves by the Roman occupiers. They cut down all the trees, and they used the trees to build more siege works. And this time, Titus had the siege works built by the Jewish captives. So if the Jews inside the temple or inside the fortress didn't want that siege works to be built, they had to shoot their own countrymen with bows and arrows to stop it. This is complete subjugation. When the fortress finally fell, the last of the fighters retreated into the temple. A Roman soldier set the temple on fire, and many Jews threw themselves into the fire to try to die nobly, or at least not at the hands of the Romans. We're talking about the most horrific period of time over about 6 years to bring this temple down that ended with human blood pouring down the steps of the temple as everybody was killing each other. And what we see here is retribution for the death of the Messiah, because both guilty parties, Romans and Jews, Gentiles and Jews, are in complete, just hellish fighting. So now when we talk about the timing of the temple falling in 70 AD, we're actually talking about a battle that took millions of lives and several years. The suffering and the cruelty cannot be overstated. They didn't have rifles and bombs. The people all died in close quarter combat. So just understand that when a Roman died, a Jew was standing, he could feel the Jewish guy's breath on him. When a Jewish guy died, he had the boot of a Roman soldier on his neck as he was run through. This is terrible. This is worse than World War I, worse than World War II. This is the most carnal destruction you can possibly imagine. And when Rome finally did win, they killed all the elderly, and they took the young, strong warriors as captives to go back to Rome and fight animals in the Colosseum. Oh, and on their way back to Rome, they got to carry with them all the temple treasures on the way back. And we know this from the actual frescoes that have been painted and preserved that. So Titus and the Romans wanted to completely make an example out of the Jewish nation and show everybody that you don't mess with them. And Titus began the siege of Jerusalem in 66 AD, and it did not fall until 70 at the cost of more than 1 million lives. The actual siege of Judea, of the entire region, started earlier and lasted longer. And after the fall of the temple, Titus razed the rest of Jerusalem and committed genocide in an attempt to complete eradication of the Jewish people, except for the compromisers. Just wanted to point that out. So, if a trumpet is blown in a city, will not the people tremble? If a calamity occurs in a city, has not Yahweh done it? Surely Adonai Yahweh does nothing unless he reveals his secret counsel to his servants, the prophets. So I want to tell you guys, thank you for sticking with me, that everything I just said only makes sense if you're a Messianic or a Christian. The scriptures in the Tanakh that hint about the second temple's destruction also include the Messiah coming at the same exact time. All the Jewish resources I've read ignore those scriptures because they don't want anybody to look at Yeshua as maybe being a Messiah. And so the reason for my little history lesson today is to answer all of these people who are trying to use Torah and whatever to reject the Messiah, Yeshua as the Messiah. You need to understand that if he's not the Messiah, then there is literally no reason and no explanation for the last 2,000 years. There is no reason why we do not have a temple. There's no reason for the temple to come down, and there's no reason why this new religion, which isn't really a new religion, it's a continuation of the old religion, but this new religion we call Christianity, to become this widespread phenomenon. Our movement is so concerned about gnats and straining at pronunciations and things that we forget that the biggest evidence we have for Yeshua to be the Messiah is that pile of rocks in Jerusalem that I had up in a couple of slides ago. People want details so bad that they're falling prey to anti-missionaries who distort the details to get people to reject the Messiah. So Luke 19, 41 to 44, when he approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace. But now they have been hidden from your eyes, for the days will come upon you, and your enemies will throw up a barricade against you, and surround you, and hem you in on every side, and they will level you to the ground, and your children with you, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. Yahweh does not do these big things without first telling us through his prophets. The destruction of the first temple was given through by Isaiah and Jeremiah, so the prophecy of the second temple is given by one who is greater than Isaiah and Jeremiah. Yeshua wept over this news. It literally hurt him. But he knew at that moment in time that the events that were bringing the temple down were set in motion 500 years prior. He knew that temple was coming down. He knew that these things all had to happen to be part of the 6,000-year plan of salvation. He knew that Jerusalem was going to be laid waste, and he told his followers in advance so that they would know when to leave. So Christianity, or the way, or Messianicism, if you want to call it that, would spread. And you'll notice that Messianics are not listed as one of the factions that were in Judea at the time of the fall, because our prophet, our Messiah, the Messiah, told anybody who would listen to leave when they saw Rome encircling the city. Uh-oh. It won't click. So, Daniel 9:27, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abomination will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. A complete destruction was prophesied, and a complete destruction happened. We focus on the temple, but we have to understand that Judea was laid waste. That Judea was a complete desolation for hundreds of years. And then when in 1948, when the UN put it back together, it was nothing. Completely desolate. Jerusalem had all of its trees cut down. When Yahweh says a complete desolation, he means a complete desolation. They stripped the land bare, because that's what Rome does. So the prophecy of the destruction of that all the Jews had to actually be the slaves to build their own siege ramps and ramparts out of their own trees so their enemies could kill their countrymen. This is a complete humiliation, a complete subjugation that took years to complete. And at the leadership of an absolute obsessed madman who couldn't ever stop. Says that's Rome. Rome can't ever stop. Whenever Rome starts something, they don't ever stop until it's done. The second temple came down after the Messiah was crucified and resurrected, and there was enough time to start the fire that is Christianity. And we have to be like we are now until there is a complete destruction. Now, keep in mind, most of the time that the Jews were under foreign rule, Persians and then Greeks and then Romans, most of the time the second temple stood, rather, the Jews were under foreign rule. They were under the rule of the Persians, they were under the rules of the Greek, they were under the rules of the Romans. Today, Jerusalem is under U.S. rule. This presents a new dilemma. Our president is supportive of Jerusalem and of Israel more than any president has ever been. And so we have to kind of raise our eyebrow. Is this part of something bigger? Not something that's going to happen tomorrow or next year, because these, like we say, these things take very, very long time to play out. But the people who are the occupants of the nation of Israel today are the descendants of the Pharisees. They're the descendants of the compromisers. Today's Jews fight under the restraints of modern political whims. They use our weapons, and they go out of their way to not kill civilians and to not have to have measured responses to incursions. They don't fight or act like they really belong in the land. And that's where the zealots come in. They don't act like they're supposed to be there. If they were supposed to be there, which actually they are supposed to be there, but if they were confident of it, they would not make covenants with the U.S. They would not make covenants. They would trust Yahweh for their defense. They would live properly. It would be different. But what's happening today is some bit of a mystery that we don't really comprehend, because God absolutely 100% preserved them to this day, and they are his children, and we pray for them to accept the Messiah, and so that we can all be, the two sticks can be joined together, and we can all, rejoice at the return of Yeshua. So in this slide, it says, I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And then in Zechariah, so many peoples and mighty nations will come to seek Yahweh of hosts in Jerusalem and to entreat the favor of Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh of hosts, in those days 10 men from all nations will grasp the garment of a Jew, saying, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. So we need to understand that these things take an incredible amount of time to play out. These last 2,000 years exist for a reason. A lot of times when I look at it, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for Rome to become the tool to carry the word of God to the western half of the world, because it's as perverted as it can possibly be. It doesn't make sense for all these nations to rise and fall, but it has happened, and it continues to happen. And we just need to understand that these prophecies take a really long time to play out. Jewish prophecy sees a 70-year period of strife with an increased tribulation of 7 years at the end. That sounds very familiar. I think a little bit too familiar. But how do we get to the fullness of the Gentiles? How do we get to that? Because I believe that to be the purpose of this era. That's the reason the gospel goes forth to the nations. It's reasons why we are called out of the blue. Guy with a Dutch last name. I have nothing to do with Israel or Jerusalem. But all of a sudden, when I read the Bible and I see that I shouldn't be eating pork, and I should be keeping the Sabbath, and I should be keeping the holy days, and I should be teaching my kids the Torah and the Tanakh, I just do it. Why? Well, maybe someday we'll understand. For here we do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking the city which is to come. Now, many people support the restoration of a third temple, and they support Israel out of their own selfishness and out of their own doctrine. A lot of it has to do with a thing called dispensationalism and all these odd schemes that aren't really in the Bible. But they believe that a third temple made with hands is going to be a sign or a key of the end of days. And I'm here to put forth a benchmark, just to kind of say that the first temple was destroyed because of syncretism. The second temple was destroyed because of the rejection of the Messiah. Why would there be a third temple? I don't know. But if the second temple didn't cause those people to accept Yeshua as the Messiah, when he had told them, there were people who were alive in AD 70 who heard Yeshua say, not one stone will be upon another. There were people who knew this, and Christianity existed, not under that name, maybe. I guess it did probably exist under the name of followers of Messiah, but they knew these sayings. They knew the sayings of Yeshua. They knew what he said. And when they saw those things, they should have grasped it. So if the destruction of the second temple of Jerusalem didn't actually cause people to accept Yeshua as the Messiah, I don't personally understand how doing it a third time is actually going to accomplish it. But I could be wrong. It just doesn't seem to me that Yahweh would allow all of the people to return to another man-made temple only for the sole purpose of destroying it. one more time. And keep in mind, it will be done in this bloody and horrific, excruciating way. And when that battle comes, which side would we be on? Because you know that the Jews aren't going to accept us. We can follow all the Torah that we want to follow. As long as we accept Yeshua as the Messiah, the modern Jewish people will not accept us as part of them. And we know that as long as we continue to keep the commandments of God, that most of Christianity and most of the Gentile world despises the God that we serve. They don't want to have any type of morality or anybody telling them what to do or what not to do. They want to just live the way they want to live. So when those two clash again, where would we fit in? I don't think we do. I think we would be like that angel that said when Joshua asked the angel, he said, well, are you for us or for our enemies? He says, I'm not for either one. So as we dig into deeper Torah study and Bible study, over time we tend to forget the big picture. We tend to start focusing on details, and our desire for the end of the sinful age also taints our study because we want to accelerate things and to see things that maybe that aren't there. But we must remember that the most important thing we can know and believe is that Yeshua is the Messiah. And whether he comes tomorrow, or whether he comes in 70 years, or whether he comes in 700 years, if we accept him as the Messiah and we live the way that he lives, when he comes back doesn't really matter. Now does it? So there's my reference slide if you guys want to pick that up, and that's all I got to say. Don't all clap at once. Are you there?
Hey, thanks, Chris.
Jeez.
Yeah, I was delaying turning on my mic. A lot to think about,
Like, did I just talk to myself for an hour?
No,
Yeah, we all.
It's a lot. I mean, when you start getting into history, no matter what era, there's so much there, and I don't know if did this study take time for you, or are all these things just etched in your brain?
Lots of time. Lots and lots of time. This is not my forte. As you guys know, Dennis, he's the history guy. This is not my forte.
Well, no, just the way it rolled off your tongue and the way you just made it flow. It seemed like it was just something that you had naturally been interested in for many years, and it was something that you had in the bank for a long time. But
I should maybe have gone into sales then.
It really is something to think about. When I like what you said when you were referring to the fact that we don't really have a clear picture of how long it could be before it plays out. Because when I get in discussions with people about, are we in the last days now? Will I live to actually see the return of our Savior? I personally don't think I will. I'm too old, and I don't think it's that imminent. Personally, that's my personal opinion. Yeah. I think most of us grow old and die before that happens, and that's maybe not a very popular thing to say.
It's not. But you can't fill pews like that, man.
I guess so. But people have their reasons. They've been convinced otherwise. So it's a lot to think about, and really appreciate you bringing that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Hey, Chris, I wanted to say something. I really appreciated that very much. One thing that caught my attention, and I wrote it out, was that you said you pulled together the fact that they left because the prophets and the Messiah said that they should leave when they saw the signs, leave. And then they did, and then that's why they weren't there. And people miss those things all the time, and I think missed that. I wondered, wow, well, how did they survive if they were sieged, you know. So I've had that in the back of my head for a long time, and I never really put that together. So that was very, very good that you were able to pull that history together in a way that brought that detail out, because those little things, that's not a little thing, that's a big thing.
It's a huge, and you had to have a faith brewing that wasn't as tied to the temple as it used to be. You know, that as we know, Paul and Peter and those guys, they continued to live in Jerusalem. They continued to keep the Torah, and they continued to follow, you know, everything they had to do with the temple. But they also had the seeds planted in them that where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am in the midst of them. They had the seeds planted that would allow a faith to continue to thrive without a temple, and that's something that is very anathema to Jewish people. So yeah, but thank you for the praise. I appreciate it. And I just started down a path of why did the temple come down? That's the question I had. Why did it come down? I didn't know. Why did that come down? So yeah,
that was really good. And that the tie to the temple thing, I wondered if that was a lot of the mixing back in that has occurred over time since then, because Christianity and Messianics, and there are many people who are very tied to a temple of some sort, because they weren't for a long time, and then all of a sudden it just started happening, and then more and more, you know. So it's kind of and at Lexington we had a seminar by Hal, and I heard of another one that was going on the same time his was, and it was interesting, same sort of subjects of that tie to things because of the mixing and how easily things can become mixed. And then David Lysen, how do you pronounce it? Lysenfeld or whatever, from California, from that church over there, Rock Valley. He gave an astounding sermon you would enjoy on the history of Christmas, but it brought in all this kind of details that was completely historical, no opinion, just like what you just did, and brought details to, I mean, we learned a lot, and we've been in this our whole lives, and we thought we knew all of it, but we didn't, and all these details are so important.
Well, and what I talked about today does have opinion in it, because I used a lot of history, I used scripture and history, and it is my opinion that Yeshua can come back without another temple. And I believe that I could probably prove that through the scriptures, but I wouldn't get in a fight with somebody who said that you had to have one. I would just have some questions for them and say, well, okay, but where do we see in the New Testament any type of prophecies of doing this all over again?
Right. Yeah.
I
wondered the same thing. So we wondered the same thing. Yeah. He's gonna it's gonna come back. We have no idea. I don't think we could even imagine how it's all gonna happen.
It's coming down. He's bringing it with him. There's lots of unknowable stuff. But thanks. And I'm glad you've been getting some good messages lately. Sounds like maybe there's a revival afoot, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, because it's coming from a lot of different people.
So, I have someone here that would like to make a comment. Someone you don't know.
Surprise!
It's my understanding that my job is to go through and correct and
of course
everything.
Yeah, everything. You're gonna be a busy guy.
Actually, we've discussed what you've talked about here in quite a bit of detail through the years, and And Don and I believe, are of the, of the opinion, again, based upon our extensive study, that Daniel 9 is completely fulfilled, which kind of agrees with what you're saying, and you really.
Whoa, this is, it's still being recorded, right? Okay.
And
You didn't know this was a confessional. There's a screen here.
Right. Right.
so, what most prophecy people have done is they don't look at the first part of Daniel chapter 9 at all. They just focus on the last few verses. And even so, they make a whole theology out of one verse.
25, right? Yeah.
Well, through, yes.
Yeah.
And then they divide it out into, a gap of 2,000 years, and without going back and seeing what the original prophecies were, okay, here's your specific point statement, and then how is this fulfilled, by the time it gets to the end of the chapter. They bring in all different assumptions, and so say, just as a summary of a prequel to where you started, is if you take Leviticus chapter 26 begins a discussion in Daniel chapter 9, and then in Jeremiah chapter 24, the prophet Jeremiah fleshes it out quite a bit. And then in the beginning of Daniel chapter 9, Daniel is pondering the prophecy from, it actually goes through Jeremiah 25. And so he's picking up Daniel 9 as he's going through Jeremiah chapter 25. And most people leave that totally out of the equation. And, but everything that was stated in the first part, that was to be done and fulfilled in Daniel 9, actually was completely fulfilled with the destruction of the second temple. If you look at it, going back to the beginnings in Torah. So, but how people got to the prophecies is in the footnotes in Matthew 24 give reference to Daniel chapter 9.
Uh-huh.
And Daniel 11. Now, if you go back and you read both references, Daniel 11, as it is in the Masoretic, reads the same as it is in Matthew 24. It translates through to the Greek. But then the Greek translation of Daniel chapter 9 reads the same as Matthew 24, whereas the Hebrew reads differently.
Hmm.
Yeah, right. So if you take through the Tanakh rendering, it doesn't seem to make as much sense from the perspective we're looking at it, looking back through Matthew 24. But but Daniel chapter 11 is definitely, end of the, age type of, pre-return of Yeshua, timeline. So we've kind of come to the conclusion here that all of Daniel chapter 9 was fulfilled with the destruction of the temple by the Romans, just as you were saying.
Okay.
So,
Great.
yeah, and
No conflict. There's got to be more. And I just found out I misspelled something.
I actually have a little color to add.
About that.
There's if you get into the individual warriors during this extended time that you're talking about, and if you go through the history, of the multiple years of siege.
Oh,
You know,
it's terrible.
yeah.
Yeah.
You see that Titus was chasing all over the place to put down the rebellion throughout the land.
Mm-hmm.
Now there was one of the zealots who actually was a very anal kind of a person. You know, not a lot of people liked him, but he was a very, you know, ruthless warrior. And Titus was chasing this. We call him nowadays of John of Giscala. In Hebrew, it was Yochanan mi Gush Halav, you know, so, or Yochanan ben Levi. He was a Levite. And I saw some interesting articles about how he actually led a drag queen army. You know, he used non-conventional warfare. So he had his guys dress up as women
Yeah.
and put the swords underneath the robes. And then, you know,
Whoa.
and you know, the warriors thought they were going past a woman, then they pull out their sword and, you know, shoot. They're, you know, they masqueraded as women. Well, and there's other rumors too. They weren't, you know, they weren't totally heterosexual either, but they had all this, you know, totally non-conventional warfare, and he was a really a nasty person. If you look at how Josephus described him, and but the Zealots had pushed the Romans out of their fortress, you know, the Antonia fortress, through this all, and so the idea of the Romans is they were going to, you know, clean up the loose ends around the countryside and then come back and besiege Jerusalem, take their fortress back. And so then another part of the story is that they went in through the tunnels underneath the city, and they knew from their records the tunnels that went into the Fortress Antonio. So that's where they actually spearheaded their battle. And then another little bit of color too is when I was there in 2017, one of the places I wanted to get down into and go through was it was kind of like an underground waterway, you know, along.
Aqueduct.
Yeah. What it was along Herod's road that went from the Pool of Siloam on up to the temple. And so when we were in the archaeology park, we just snuck down a little hatch. You know, it had a ladder. It's actually, we didn't know it at the time, but it was the exit from the tour, and went down below where they had the aquifers, where they held the water for the mikveh, you know, the baptismal pools. And then we started to go down while the tour was coming up. So we finally figured, well, they said, oh, it's a really long way down to the Pool of Siloam. So we took a little side trip and ended up in the Royal Palace, which they were just digging out. But what the people thought they could, you know, escape. That was one of their pathways of escape, but the Romans had blocked that. So they had, like, you know, hundreds or thousands of people down in that little, you know, about 2 people wide stone
Passageway.
aquifer. Yeah. And they just went down and they just slaughtered the people. They were just packed in there, and they just, you know, they killed one after the other, went right down to the end over the dead people. And, you know, it's just like you said. I mean, that was a massive slaughter of proportions that we aren't really even grasping nowadays.
Right.
Fully fulfilled. And basically what it was is Jeremiah was pondering the 5th punishment from Leviticus 26. It said there would be 7 punishings. And of the, you know, of skipping the weekly Sabbath for the 70 years, you know, 70 times 7, that was another, you know, and so then as a result of that, the mirror was a 70 weeks prophecy, which you basically described as a period of years leading up to the Messiah. And then I believe, or we believe, I think you can correct me, Don, but that after the Messiah being cut off in the 3.5 years before the 70 weeks are fulfilled, is that the church was still fulfilling the witness, because it said there would be a witness to Jerusalem as a city. Was the entire purpose of Daniel 9 was as a witness to Jerusalem, not to give the prophecy of the very end. It was the 6th punishment, not the 7th. And so, but yeah, there'd be a whole lot to talk about as far as details, but it actually, your summary kind of meshed with the way we're looking at it here, and that all these people coming up with all these different explanations about the 70 weeks relating to the end time to me, they're just bogus.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, this is about as far as I'm going to get into it. I mean, I just, in the outline of life, it just doesn't seem that it's not blasphemy. It just doesn't seem that it fits to do it all over again. That's all, and that's why this started with why do Jewish people believe the temple came down? Because if you're a Christian, if you believe in the New Testament, you believe Yeshua is the Messiah. Well, we know why, and we know when, and we know everything makes sense. So that's the question that started this off, and also the tie-in of so many people are, just getting into these details and rejecting the Messiah. It's
now
painful.
Throw this in real quick. John Thornton, which I think is Mark, doesn't have a microphone. He says, "I don't think there will be a temple before the return, and when it is rebuilt, it will be built on Mount Olivet." And he's got Ezekiel 11:23 and Zechariah 14:4. And I don't think there will be a temple either. Only thing that's mentioned is the return to the sacrifices. Well, you don't need a temple for that. All you need is an altar and a person to do the executing.
The tent of meeting, and that's what Jim Barfield has kind of found that, and so it's not literally found it, but he's found a bunch of sites through the Copper Scroll that was believed to be written and recorded by Prophet Jeremiah, who hid the stuff on the way out of the first temple. So that's the other thing that people don't realize, is that they didn't have all the stuff from the first temple in the second temple. Most of the stuff from the first temple stayed hidden. All the most precious things stayed hidden. The only thing that came back was the stuff that got hauled away. But Jeremiah and his party managed to stash the stuff. And Barfield deciphered the Copper Scroll and has some pretty interesting sites as to where it is. So somebody found the stuff. When the time is right, the stuff will be found. And that's when you could go back to doing that as well. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to mention at this point, they have all of the utensils needed. They've recreated them, or
thanks to the Muslims.
They have the young prophets, the young priests that started in 1998. So they have adult priests who were trained from infancy, like Samuel, and they, on the high days, they have what they call demonstration sacrifices, which they fulfill the sacrifices literally, and as a demonstration to people. They're kind of informal. They don't want to make it look like they're redoing temple stuff, so they keep it pretty informal and just like teaching for children. But like Don was saying, all they need is just the tabernacle, which, that's how David did it until Solomon's temple was built, as they had the tabernacle in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, in Daniel 9 doesn't say that there's going to be a rebuilding of the temple at the end, and that they're going to be sacrificing there, and the sacrifice will be cut off. We believe that refers to Messiah being cut off, and putting an end, because it says earlier to put an end to sin. So if you look at this, at all the specific purpose statement at the beginning, and then all of the points to be fulfilled, everything in Daniel 9 was fulfilled at the destruction of the second temple.
Mm-hmm. The interesting thing was when the Muslims wanted to add on to the Dome of the Rock thingy that they built, they dug out a good chunk of that area, and in the dirt piles that were thrown off to the side, they actually found artifacts of the temple, some of the tools of the art, the
Lavers and stuff, yeah.
Right. The tools and stuff. They found a lot of that in the dirt that was removed to add on to one of their worship things. So it's ironic.
Well, they're practicing. They have a life-size. They have like a life-size model or a 1/5 scale. I don't know. Mike's been over there, and it's fascinating stuff. But it's still difficult because we don't want to be replacement theology people. We don't want to say the church replaces Israel, because it doesn't. It just doesn't. We're grafted into something. But at the same time, that something different is happening now and has been for 2,000 years. And when it comes back, we can't be so convinced of things that if it comes back slightly different, that we don't do the whole, oh, that's what that meant. That's the hard thing. And the folks who are so focused on details and they're so focused on being right, they forget that what we have is a faith. Faith is things that are unseen, right? We don't have a science. A science is something that's proved to you. We have a faith. And so there's things that we're just not going to understand. As far as we go, there's so much that we can't understand because we've never seen a functional temple. We've never lived that. So we're so far removed from first century Judea that,
right. And that synagogue system they have today, I don't think was what they had back then.
No, but it's an evolution of it, because they had a synagogue system, and the Torah portions, and there's some interesting stuff, and I don't know.
Well,
but hey,
another point is that they kind of skewed. Jewish people tend to be good storytellers, and they skewed in the temple model. They skewed it from the way Josephus describes it. So I've kind of gone through that and paced things out when I was over there. And where the Dome of the Rock is actually like a cliff there. I mean, it's solid rock down underneath.
Okay.
The Dome of the Rock. And that was actually the southern end of Fortress Antonio. It wasn't just the one part that they talk about. That was just one guard tower on the northwest corner. But if you come to the south, the actual, if you actually measure it out the way Josephus describes it, their wall would have been where the Dome of the Rock is, looking down on the temple. And so the temple actually would have been between the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. In the green area in between, and they don't dare dig there because they'd find a whole lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. But and that's one of the three original or official versions, is what I'm saying, and which I think is more correct, because if you measure it out from the Dome of the Rock to the south steps, the south wall, and then you go the length, that does come out to about 13 acres, which is what, if you convert from their measuring at that time, it's about right. And so I believe that like the steps on the south wall are actually original steps. And then I actually saw the rocks, sat on the rocks that were thrown down from the top of the temple, and they were thrown down from quite a height because they broke up the pavement. And and they've got a lot dug out now. And so I think the way they portray it is, what do you call that? A little bit of hyperbole, making it larger than what it really was in order to claim more territory of the, in other words, like they put the temple up on the cliff on the Dome of the Rock, that expands their historic Jewish, holdings, you might say. But
they don't, I don't know if you guys followed the Copper Scroll with Jim Barfield at all, but he identified these 4 spots, and they were like, yeah, whatever. And then he showed more as evidence, and they thought, okay, maybe it's real. And then when they went and they did the magnetometers and sonar and stuff, and started digging, and they found there was, they got down 2 meters, and there was man-made cement from the time of Jeremiah. So they stopped. They don't want to find it. So because if they find it, they have World War III.
Right.
If they actually find this stuff, then the Catholics, the Muslims, everybody's going to converge like you wouldn't believe. And the other thing is that if the time's not right and they try to force it, then you end up with the kind of a Raiders of the Lost Ark, kind of outcome. If they go in there and grab it and it's not the right time, that's not going to work out at all.
There's plenty enough area for a large Fortress Antonio if you take the Dome of the Rock up into the Muslim quarter, up to the pools of Bethesda. There is plenty of room for barracks for 6,000, a legion of soldiers. And so they have distorted their presentation of the Temple Mount in order to hopefully claim, more areas having a Jewish history. But most of the Temple Mount was actually the Fortress Antonio, a Roman fortress, which was, once the Romans retook their fortress, then they proceeded with the total destruction of the city, taking it down, so it was all ground level. And another point is that whole perimeter wall around the Temple Mount and the old city of Jerusalem was all built by the Muslim empires, with Suleiman being the prime one that did most of the rocks, placed most of the rocks to build the walls. You got to go, it's just the bottom layer or so is Herodian stones, and they, when I was there, they were saying how the big, it's somewhere between a 500 and 600 ton Herodian stone. The Romans couldn't move it. It was the bottom foundation stone in the northwest corner, and they tried to move it and they couldn't. So there's one layer that's original, and the rest was all buried underneath the dirt.
Well,
they took it down right to the bottom.
The prophecy was not one stone will be left upon another.
Yeah.
So you can leave the base as long as there's nothing on it.
And that's the wall. Who knows what happened to the temple? That might have even, when they're burning, it might just be a pile of ash, because the limestone will burn.
Yeah, it will lose its integrity.
But the perimeter wall stones, quite of those, they were just thrown down, so then they were easy to put back in place during well, there was different Muslim occupations, but most of it was during the Ottoman era under Sultan Suleiman.
Wow.
So we rebuilt it all.
So,
well, hey, anybody else? Because I've had a heck of a week, and I'm gonna go upstairs and see what my family's up to. Going once, going twice.
air crickets.
All right.
Hey,
Well, good night, everybody.
Chris,
Aha.
can you go back to the point where you said there were 4 factions, and then go over all the material one more time?
All the material one more time?
I'm kidding. Thank you.
I'm literally doing it. So.
No, I'm kidding.
Okay.
I wanted to say thank you and
All right.
appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good Sabbath. And,
Yeah,
thank
You
you.
too.
thanks for letting me present. Thanks for showing up.
Thank you
Good
for
night.
rescuing me because I wasn't planning properly. I appreciate that.
No problem. I got your back, man. Good night, everybody. Nice to
All
see you,
right,
Mike.
Chris.
Good night.
Bye. Bye.
Well, that does conclude our regularly scheduled portion of our program tonight. We now switch over to fellowship.